Walls, a Flamestone Trilogy short story by Holly Hook. Mowgli, what are you hissing at? Jenna sat up on the edge of her bed, tossing down her copy of Alice in Wonderland. It was her latest escape from a world that failed her. Her cat stood on the floor, staring at the hole in the bottom of her wall again. There were a lot of holes in her new foster home, especially in her bedroom. Such was the story of her life. Come on, really? It was the third time this week he'd done that, and it was getting annoying. Every time she got away from her mother and earned some time to herself, he did this, breaking her from her focus. Maybe she'd have to find some other place in this house to do her reading. Mowgli ignored her and puffed up larger, looking like a steel gray panther who needed to lose weight. His tail morphed into a giant pipe cleaner, and he growled at the hole. Are you really that scared of mice? Jenna stood up, wiggling her freezing toes in her socks, and she hoped it wasn't a rat living in that hole instead. The house was old, way older than the creepy guy her foster mom had rented it from. It had lots of dips in the floor and plenty of drafts, some of which seemed to come from some damp place underground. She wondered how many other kids went through here as they got shuffled around the system. Mowgli hissed again, backing so far away from the wall that he rammed his rear end into the side of Jenna's bed. She sat up, because something wasn't right here, and her heart thudded in response. Her cat was smart enough to turn on the washing machine by himself so he could sit on top of it and enjoy the free massage. Jenna had read a story once where a cat warned a woman about a fire in the wall and saved her life. She scrambled down onto the floor and sat next to Mowgli. All right, genius, is this dump finally burning down? She smelled no smoke, so she pulled Mowgli to her side. He was so warm she could keep him there all night. Mowgli twisted in her grip and howled, letting out a low, mournful sound. He broke free and darted down the hall, his enormous feet thundering down the stairs. Hey! Jenna sat there, staring at the doorway her cat had just bolted through. She rubbed the line of pain on her leg as he'd nailed her with his back claws by mistake. Maggie, her foster mom, yelled something at him that Jenna could never repeat in class. It figured. Maggie had hated Mowgli since Jenna had found him starving next to a trash can up in town. That happened a few months ago, right after she came to stay with Maggie, and now she fed him with lawn mowing money. There wasn't much else for a 15-year-old to do when it came to making money. At least, Maggie hadn't tried to hurt him. Maybe she feared Jenna going to the social worker, although Chris insisted Jenna stay with Maggie for her own good. The system was beyond broken. Ignoring the pain of her scratch, Jenna leaned closer to the opening and sniffed, but no smoke stung her nostrils. The air coming from the hole smelled damp with a trace of dirt and dust, as it always did. She turned around in her room, staring at the old, empty moving boxes, some left over from other kids. She had a flashlight somewhere. It was a cheap one that came in one of those dollar store surprise bags meant for little kids, but it could work. Maggie got her the bag for Christmas. Jenna pulled her clothing box off another that was a permanent home for her books, then moved that aside to reach the junk box. The green handle of the flashlight stuck out from under the torn flap. Jenna clicked it on. It gave off a weak glow, like the dull light bulb overhead, but it would have to work. She flopped down to her side on the floor and aimed the weak beam at the hole. The yellowing wall turned bright, but the hole looked darker at first. The damp smell grew stronger, and Jenna thought of the rabbit hole in Alice in Wonderland. This one looked more jagged and sinister, and yes, it was big enough to let a rat into her room. She never dared to peek in before for precisely that reason. Jenna expected insulation, chewed wood, mouse turds, and other debris to fill the space beyond the wall surface. Instead, she found only darkness, and could make out nothing past where the hole started. The floor past the entrance seemed to drop off into nothingness, and it was as if the crack in the wall opened into a void. A breeze shot out, whistling around Jenna's ears. Then a faint, bizarre squeak, along with an odd skittering, emerged from the depths. She scrambled back and held back a cry. The flashlight slid across the floor and hit one of her boxes. Jenna hit the back of her bed. She kept her gaze locked on the hole. The hole stayed dark as ever, and the earthy smell faded. She sucked in a breath to make sure it had gone. Maybe she should get Maggie to come up and look at this, because a hole into nothingness wasn't normal, especially on the second floor. Not a good idea. You're better off dealing with this yourself. Maggie would come up here, roll her eyes, and head back downstairs if she was lucky. If not, Jenna would get more chores to do, like washing the dishes and mowing the house's overgrown lawn. Jenna pushed the junk box over to where the hole in the wall waited like an open mouth. She'd cover it up for now because there was no way she could sleep in this room otherwise. After school, Jenna always tried to get up to her room without Maggie noticing, so she could have some time to get all her homework done before bed and sneak out to a movie with Monique. When she got in the door, Mowgli rubbed against her legs, purring so loudly she wondered if nothing spooked him yesterday, and she just imagined it. She leaned down to pet him, and he nudged his head into her open palm. "Well, hey there." Jenna smelled the wine before she saw Maggie on the couch. Slowly, her foster mom turned to face her as a home shopping network played on the TV. She held a mostly empty glass in her hand as if she were celebrating something. Jenna swallowed. "Oh, did you find a job?" Maggie always said she was looking, and Jenna couldn't figure how she paid the rent. Maggie's expression hardened as if she insulted her. "Jenna, get those dishes done, and then the back deck needs some cleanup." Jenna molded her face into a neutral mask, knowing that refusing would get her backpack stolen and her homework undone unless she complied. Okay. She dropped her backpack full of books in the entryway, and it made a loud thud that her mother didn't turn her head at, arguing that she had multiple assignments counted as talking back in this house, and she'd learned that rule the hard way during the past few months. Jenna was used to the endless shuffle of foster homes with uncaring attitudes. Mowgli looked up at her, yellow eyes wide and nervous. At least she had him. Jenna filled the sink and watched the suds climb higher and higher. Mowgli remained under her legs, her constant companion. "Oh, and after you clear the back deck, the laundry needs to get started and then folded. Once that's done, you can go ahead and make yourself some dinner." "Stop letting her treat you like this." The voice rose from somewhere in her depths, shocking her, as she'd never heard it before. She stopped washing and accidentally dropped the glass into the sink. There wasn't enough water inside to stop the dreaded crack. "What was that?" Anger filled Maggie's voice as it cracked its way into the kitchen. Her tone came out clipped, and she didn't even mean it. "I dropped a glass." Jenna should apologize, but this time, the two words refused to come out. A pause dragged out, filled with tension, and then she heard the couch creak, followed by Maggie's ominous footsteps. Her foster mom rounded the corner, face bent not into a scowl but a grin. "You're going to learn quick not to talk back to authority." "I wasn't talking back. I see no remorse in your face." Maggie bore down like an angry bull, lifting one arm as Mowgli hissed. A loud knock sounded at the door, making her jump. Her mother froze, lowering her arm. "Get that!" Her breath stank from the wine, making Jenna's eyes water. Jenna went to the door, heart pounding, letting her breath out slowly so Maggie wouldn't hear. If the guest stayed for more than a few minutes, her foster mom might cool off and go back to her spot on the couch. Mr. Larconi, the old landlord, stood on the porch. Behind him, his black Mercedes sat parked in the driveway. He drummed his ring-laden fingers on the porch railing. Colors and money bounced up and down in front of Jenna as if he was just here to flaunt his wealth. She liked him as much as she liked Maggie. But why was he here when the rent wasn't due for a few more weeks? The old man stood there, clearing his throat. "Oh, hi." Jenna could think of nothing else to say as Mowgli appeared from between her ankles, gray fur shining in the sun. He meowed at her, and she'd never heard him so loud, insistent, and nervous. Mr. Larconi smiled, showing a pair of gold teeth in the front of his mouth. Jenna wanted to back away, but Maggie came up behind her, leaving her nowhere to go. "How are things going?" he asked in a voice thick and smooth like syrup. It was something Jenna felt like you could get caught in, like a spider's web. "Fine." Mowgli pawed at her legs, so she picked him up and slung him over her shoulder. Mr. Larconi glanced at her pet. Shadows fell over his face, and his mouth curved down into a frown. Jenna tightened her grasp on Mowgli as her gut tingled with nerves. She backed away from the door. "I guess you want to talk to Maggie and she's right here." "Yes, I would." His tone carried a heavy dose of "go away now." Jenna backed away to let her mother into the doorway. She carried Mowgli down the hall and up the stairs to her room. "Come on, genius." The sounds of the conversation floated up after her, but at least the anger was gone from her foster mom's voice. She passed the old grandfather clock at the end of the hall and ducked into her room. Jenna closed the door, set Mowgli down on her bed, and lay down beside him. He curled up in a ball next to her, purring, and Jenna put her hand over him, running it down his fur and listening to the soothing sound. Her heart slowed, and she breathed deeply. The lump in her throat softened. She snuggled closer to Mowgli and put her ear on him, listening as his purr got louder. Jenna let her gaze wander over the old walls, where the traces of ink graffiti, initials, and hearts struggled to show through the layers of paint. A star design came into focus right above her bed, and a signature in cursive hung under the window, unreadable. A newer sketch of a bird in permanent marker flew away from the closet. How many other kids had gone through this house? Maggie made a career of fostering then. "You're the only thing in this house keeping me sane." She put her chin up against Mowgli's head and closed her eyes, knowing she wouldn't fall asleep. If she were lucky, she could escape for a little while. Leaving this place sounded good, but where would she and Mowgli go? They unfortunately needed Maggie, and talking back to her would not get them anywhere. Footsteps thudded up the stairs. Jenna's vision flashed to the silver of shock, and she opened her eyes as a knock sounded at the door. Maggie's impatience jabbed through the closed door, striking her in the chest. "Jenna! Mr. Larconi needs to come in and check on a hole in the wall, and you're in the way! Come downstairs and finish the dishes!" Great. She went to collect Mowgli, but his ears rose and he stared at her bedroom door as if a predator would come through. She opened the door. Her foster mother still had a dangerous glint in her eye, so it might be worth stalling before she went downstairs. "Let me go to the bathroom first. I'll be right down." Her mother turned her back and went down the stairs without a word. Mr. Larconi pushed past her like she didn't exist, closing the door behind him. Wow, that guy was weird. Jenna set Mowgli down in the hallway and went into the bathroom. Something felt off about everything in this place, and she couldn't put her finger on it. Mowgli meowed on the other side of the door. Jenna looked down at the drain in the sink. Monique. Her friend would help, or at least tell her that her paranoia was in her head. No, she'd tell her to get away from Maggie even if she had to talk to the social worker. She almost hit you. That was something Jenna couldn't ignore, but what could she do? If she didn't get on a foster's good side, she'd get kicked out the moment she turned 18. "Jenna! Get down here now and finish these dishes!" She sighed and watched her smile drop away in the mirror. Jenna opened the bathroom door and headed back downstairs. Mowgli growled somewhere in the darkness. Jenna turned over in bed, blinking away the heavy sleep. The streetlight poured in through her blinds, making lines across the opposite wall. Her head still pounded from staying awake until midnight to finish her homework. She moved her legs and bumped into her cat, who stood at the foot of her bed, not moving. He faced away from her, back arched, ears flattened as he lowered his body, crushing her feet. "What now?" A skittering sound followed. Then she remembered the hole that the landlord hadn't patched up, and something told her to move. Jenna had forgotten to put the junk box back in front of it before bed. Something must have crawled out of it. The skittering came from her desk, and a shadow moved behind her stack of school books. Jenna's heart exploded in panic, racing as if it were about to drown. She held her breath, unable to move. This wasn't any mouse. Mowgli hadn't played with those before. Jenna scrambled over and turned on her bedroom light. A squeal of pain sounded from her desk. She jumped, whirling around to face it. Mowgli remained vigilant at the foot of the bed, not taking his stare off Jenna's homework. Another squeak bubbled up from behind her books. Jenna sucked in a breath and let her eyes adjust to the streetlight, which cast a soft glow on her desk. She stood, frozen in place, and waited for the intruder to reveal itself. If it was a rat, she couldn't tell just what she was eyeing at first, but whatever now stood behind her books wore a hat. A red and yellow striped cone poked up from behind the wall of paper and cardboard. It moved, shifting closer to the edge like the wearer was getting braver. A shockwave of terror shot through her, and she staggered back, hitting the wall. Was this a joke? Some creepy little lawn gnome wannabe was standing on her desk like a fairy tale gone bad. Mowgli faced her and hissed, and that broke her paralysis. They were getting out of here. Neither she nor Mowgli were coming back into this room again. Jenna rushed to her bed, put her arms around her cat, and pulled him close to her. He grabbed at her shoulder with his paws, hanging on for dear life. His heart beat against her chest, matching her own. She turned, glimpsing her desk, and right then, the creature moved out in plain view. It was 6 inches tall with 2 arms, 2 legs, and a head. It pressed up against the back of her desk, dressed in red and yellow stripes. Its huge frog eyes took up most of its face. They were the color of rotting algae and of vomit and every illness she'd ever had. The thing blinked with huge filmy lids like it was in pain. A wave of nausea socked Jenna out of nowhere. She doubled over and dropped Mowgli. Bile rose in her throat, and she staggered, reaching out to steady herself on the desk. Mowgli! It came out automatically as Jenna fell to her knees. The room tilted, and her head felt like air. She was going to pass out and maybe even die right here. Why did she feel like this? She didn't have a weak stomach, and she could even handle watching surgery on TV. The thing's eyes were doing this to her. She closed her own eyes and tightened her grip on the desk. If she caught another glimpse of that creature's eyes, she might die. Mowgli jumped, and while Jenna couldn't see him collide with the creature, it was obvious from the way her papers crashed on her desk. The tiny monster squeaked and skittered across the surface. Jenna coughed, trying to keep the contents of her stomach down. The floor threatened to rise to her face. Why wasn't Mowgli sick too? The thing ran across her barefoot, and its feet felt like little claws. Jenna was too sick to do anything except let out a groan of horror. Mowgli crashed into the wall with a loud thump. He chased it back into its hole. Jenna slumped against the leg of her desk. She could rest now. The ringing in her head died down, and Jenna's consciousness stopped tilting enough so she could open her eyes. Mowgli stood guard near the hole, tail swishing back and forth, and she breathed a sigh that the sickness hadn't taken him. She hoped he'd keep the creature from coming back out. Slowly, her stomach calmed from a storm at sea to a serene lake. Jenna sat there, listening to her own breath and watching Mowgli's tail swish. It was all she could do as her body trembled with exhaustion, like the creature's eyes had sucked the life from her. Mowgli left his post, and his yellow eyes were friendly again. He trilled and rubbed her as if satisfied with his work. His fur made tiny zaps of static electricity as he did so, but Jenna welcomed every single one. She petted him, taking in his silky coat and feeling the soft motor of his purr start up. Despite the event she couldn't wrap her mind around, Jenna was too tired to feel any fear, and with Mowgli here, she felt safer. Thanks, genius. I love you, and you're lucky that thing didn't make you hack up a hairball. Did she have the strength to stand up now? The answer was yes if she lingered and she scooped up her cat. He rubbed his face against hers, and his silky coat was soft and comforting. Mowgli purred louder, and Jenna swore it was the best sound in the world. They were both sleeping on the couch tonight, and she was shutting the bedroom door. Right then, Jenna made a decision she thought she'd never make. Tomorrow we're leaving. This time, she knew she meant it, and no matter how scary the world was out there, it was better than here. I don't care where we go so as long as it's not here. Jenna's friend Monique jumped up and down, squealing, when Jenna told her about her plan after the class let out the next day. Of course, she only mentioned Maggie lifting her hand. You're finally leaving? It's about time, and you'll be way happier with staying with me. Monique opened her sticker-covered locker. You'll have to stay in the basement, though. but I'm sure Mom and Dad will be totally okay with it. I know. You've been begging me to stay with you for years. You win. Jenna hiked her books up, holding back tears of relief. Monique's parents had always liked her, and Jenna was lucky the social worker had kept her in town. That was one reason Jenna had tried to stick it out with Maggie. Her friend's family was her only escape when school wasn't in session. Tell them I'll get a job and help with food. Are they fine with my cat? She wouldn't leave Mowgli alone with Maggie, or those things in the house. Jenna still couldn't believe it, and she wondered if Mr. Larconi knew about them. But why investigate the hole in the wall if he did? Maybe she'd hallucinated or dreamed the whole thing. But Jenna was almost sure if she went back up to her room again, her desk would still be a mess from where Mowgli had gone after that thing. If she didn't check, she could go on hoping it was just a nightmare. You don't have to do that, and yeah, I've told you about 1,000 times they like your cat. I'll be there down at the corner tonight at 11. Just hop in with whatever you can carry. And Mowgli. Her friend leaned up against the locker. I know you're scared, and I would be too, if I had to deal with a system like that. Jenna waited for the crowd to thin around them in the halls, and then she smiled. Monique, thanks. I'll be there. Monique slipped off her ring, the black one with the silver spikes. Hold out your hand. Really? We haven't done the promise ring since junior high. Jenna and Monique exchanged it every time they made a deal. Monique first gave it to her when she swore she'd tell no one that Jenna did the dirty graffiti in the bathroom stall with permanent markers. Jenna gave it back when she vowed she'd keep her silence about Monique's crush on Jaden, the nerdy boy in the astronomy club. Jenna held out her hand, and Monique slid it onto her middle finger. That was so fitting, and it brought another smile to her face. Why hadn't she done this years ago? Monique flashed an evil grin. You have some backbone after all. Jenna had to try very hard to avoid looking happy when she stepped through the door of the old house. She refused to think of it as her house after school. These were her last hours here, and the last time she'd have to see Maggie. After this, it was the great unknown. Jenna dropped her backpack in the doorway and listened, waiting for the list of chores that she would complete with a smile, so long as Maggie didn't see it. Her mother said nothing, and today, no chip bags crinkled, and no television droned away. Stranger yet, Maggie had closed all the curtains, casting the house in gloom. Jenna felt like she stepped into a vampire house. The sound of a metal latch opening floated in from the kitchen, followed by a desperate meow. Mowgli. Jenna's heart went off like a horse shocked by a loud noise, and she raced into the kitchen. Maggie leaned over an ugly tan cat carrier with her free hand under Mowgli's stomach. Her cat struggled to get away, and Mowgli shot her a desperate look and meowed. What is this? Maggie glared at her, and her eyes turned to ice. She wore too much makeup, like she was trying to impress someone. Whatever your cat did last night woke me up, so he's going. Her pulse roared in her ears, and her knees trembled with terror. No, he's not! Jenna had to hang in there. If there was any time to have guts, it was now. You can do this. She and Mowgli were almost out of here, and she would not let him down now. Maggie stared so hard at her that if Jenna were a glass, she would have shattered. Mowgli struggled against her chest. Her voice came out low and dangerous, as if there was something Jenna didn't know. You don't need him anymore. Maybe he'll get adopted from the shelter if he's lucky. Mowgli howled again and lunged forward. He broke her mother's grip, but then she caught him, flattening him against the kitchen floor and drawing a yelp. Jenna charged forward as all rational thought left her, and every instinct of self-preservation flew away. All that mattered was her cat, the only thing in the house she cared about. Get your hands off him! She shoved and hit Maggie square in the shoulders. Her foster mother flew back, and Mowgli bolted from the kitchen, thundering down the hall and up the stairs. The world fell silent as Jenna stood there and waited for the rest. Heat flooded her as she trembled, knowing she should say not just something, but everything. But she couldn't do anything except stand there and watch. Why couldn't she just do it already? Her foster mom remained still on the floor and slowly turned her head to look at her. But instead of anger, Jenna found something far more terrifying. Her face was unreadable. and her eyes were far too calm. Something made a clicking noise somewhere and skittered, and Maggie kept staring at Jenna as if she were waiting. Sickness rose in Jenna, and the fury inside her died. A chill swept through the room, and it carried with it a damp, cold smell. It was the same smell that came from the hole upstairs. "Maggie, do you hear that?" Another clicking sound, almost insect-like, followed, and Jenna placed it somewhere in the kitchen behind Maggie. Maggie gave her a smug nod. "Yes, I hear it." A tiny monster appeared over her foster mom's shoulder. A pointed hat, a pair of sick green eyes. One of those creatures stood on her mother's shoulders. "Maggie!" A tsunami of nausea and faintness swept over Jenna, and she thudded to the kitchen floor. Rapids rushed through her veins and chest as linoleum spread out before her. The cabinet doors of the kitchen all flew open, banging so loudly that the white flashed across Jenna's graying vision. More of the creatures poured out, and they skittered to the floor, chattering, swarming her like ants around a hapless victim. They ran across her and grabbed her hands with appendages that felt more like pincers than hands. Claws seized her ankles and pulled at her. The floor swarmed with red and yellow points. They looked like membranes, not hats, with flashes of disgusting green that made the vomit rise in Jenna's throat. Her mother appeared over her, staring down with no emotion. The creatures avoided her mother's gaze, but the sickness held Jenna to the floor. It wouldn't fade for minutes. Mowgli was upstairs, and Monique wouldn't get here for hours. Jenna held up her hand, silently asking Maggie to help her up and get her out of the house. "This is the last time you'll disobey," Maggie said with a hint of smile. "It's about time you paid off." The creature on her foster's shoulder peeked down at her again with those poisonous orbs. A wave of faintness swept over her. Jenna closed her eyes and sank down into a darkness so deep that even these creatures would steer clear of it. "Half, remember?" Maggie spoke from somewhere outside of Jenna's private darkness. Something poured nearby, like a million marbles getting dumped from a giant bag, but the sound didn't soothe her. Jenna had an old collection of marbles somewhere, so Maggie must be going through all her stuff now and dumping it on the kitchen floor. The memories flashed. The kitchen, those things, and Maggie standing over her. What if those evil gnome things were still around here somewhere? Nearby, someone else shifted and plastic crinkled. "Is that all?" Maggie was talking to someone else in the room. Keep your eyes shut, Jenna thought. Just thinking of those green frog eyes brought a wave of sickness to Jenna's guts. Maggie was in league with them. Jenna kept her breathing slow and level. She had to get up, go grab Mowgli, and just go. It was the only way she was going to survive this. Mowgli would be upstairs in her room. If she got up and ran, she'd find him hiding from her mother in the covers of her bed. If she had to, she could hold him and slide down the roof of the porch outside. This isn't kitchen. The thought struck her like a baseball bat to the face as the floor Jenna lay on chilled her skin. Air smelled like dirt and moisture instead of tobacco smoke and coffee. Jen had once gone on a tour of Mammoth Cave down in Kentucky with Monique and her family. This reminded her of that, and not in a good way. It was the same smell as that coming out of that hole in her room. More marbles poured out just feet away, and the plastic crinkled again. Now a man spoke. "Yes, I know. Here's yours and don't ask questions." It was Mr. Larconi, and he was the one pouring out the marbles. "I want to see your half before I accept mine. That was the deal, and yes, I kept it in writing." Maggie's voice grew rougher, echoing off the walls. Mr. Larconi snorted. "Sure, Maggie, that's going to stand up in court. Maybe back when slavery was still legal." Slavery? Jenna had to open her eyes just a little. If she was going to escape this, she had to see where she was. They were underground. An oil lamp on a wall of rough stone gave out the only light, turning everything into ugly grays and yellows. The floor looked the same, but smoother, like it had seen the pressure of millions of feet. Jenna could see nothing past where the light ended. It was as if the wall and the lamp's range were an island of light in a void of nothingness. Maggie and Mr. Larconi stood in front of the lamp, having a staring contest over a 2-foot-high pile of pebbles on the floor. Mr. Larconi still held the garbage bag he dumped them out of. "Well, Maggie?" Mr. Larconi asked, crossing his arms. The low light levels made shadows under his cheeks, and he looked like a demon. From somewhere in the darkness, things skittered and giggled. The noise echoed off the stone, coming from everywhere at once. An icy fist seized Jenna's heart, and her plan exploded. There would be no running up to her room. They were in that place beyond the hole in the wall, the place where those creatures lived. Her mother put her hands on her hips. "I want my full share. And don't take all day. I need a cigarette." Jenna squinted. It wasn't pebbles on the floor. Mr. Larconi had poured out a vast pile of shining gemstones. All colors, shapes, and sizes. Thousands waited there, enough to promise money for the rest of their lives. Her mother and Mr. Larconi were selling her to those creatures and splitting the cash. The thought made a whimper of terror rise inside her. They had snatched away her freedom right when she could see daylight, and worst of all, Mowgli would go to the shelter. "This is no fairy tale and you've got to move." She couldn't lie here and give up, not when she was almost there. If she could get that oil lamp and leave her mother and Mr. Larconi in the dark, she might have a chance of finding the exit if she kept her gaze away from the floor. "Well, Maggie, are you going to pick those up or stand there all night? We've been doing this for years, so take it or leave it." The landlord's smile made more ugly shadows stretch over his face. More skittering came from everywhere, and the sound echoed so much she couldn't tell how far they were away or how many there were. Those monsters would pop out again any second, and they were getting impatient. Once the transaction was done, those gnomes would swarm back out of the darkness. "It should be more," Maggie said. "I'm the one who sheltered her and finished her training, and I've spent years honing my techniques, so I deserve a raise." "Training?" Jenna shot up from the floor, and she wobbled and barely kept her footing. "What kind of sick people are you?" The two of them turned to face her. Mr. Larconi looked at her mother. Doubt crept over his features. Her mother stood there, mouth falling open, but then the familiar anger hardened her features. "Jenna, sit down or you will face what you did in the kitchen again. If you don't follow the dweller's orders here, you won't live much longer." "What did you do? Sell other foster kids to whatever this is too?" Jenna needed to fight. If she didn't, she'd never see daylight again. Rage built up inside her like a volcano ready to explode. They'd snatch her life right away when it was about to start and let her get her hopes up just to crush her. There had to be a way to fight back. These things have to have a weakness. At least, they always had them in stories. And then it hit her. The closed curtains in the house, and the fact that those things hid in walls. They hated the light. Mr. Larconi moved in front of the lamp, casting a long, gangly shadow. The clicking of tiny claws drew closer. If she avoided their eyes, she might have a chance. Jenna stared at the people who thought she was nothing but an object, and her pulse hissed in her ears. Maggie glared at her like she was trying to poison Jenna with her gaze. Jenna waited for their tiny hands to wrap around her ankles, but they never came. "So is this why you never got off your butt and got a job?" Jenna couldn't stop the words. She wished the creatures would bring down the cave on top of these two. Maggie curved her mouth into a smile. "You've got no one, Jenna, and kids like you are just dead weight to the world. You might as well give your worth back in the only way you can." The skittering sound continued, drawing closer, and her mother reached over to seize the lantern. Once the light went out, those things would close in, and she knew she had no chance at fighting them off. There were hundreds of them, maybe even thousands. "You're wrong." Monique cared, and so did Mowgli! He charged from the darkness and crouched down in front of Jenna, hissing at her captors. He'd followed them all the way to wherever they were. His gray form shone under the lantern, and Mr. Larconi glowered at him. "We don't need a cat down here." Maggie gave him a dismissive wave. "Ignore him. He follows the girl. He'll be out of the house." Mr. Larconi's gaze darkened. "The dwellers can control cats, and if cats pick off any more of them, we'll stop getting payments." Mowgli hadn't abandoned her. "Then I'll grab him." Maggie curled her fingers like claws. "You're not touching him!" Jenna grabbed onto her anger and charged Maggie. Maggie put her arms up, ready for the attack, but at the last second, Jenna swerved and kicked at Mr. Larconi. She hit the gem pile and sent sparkling blobs of color flying. Some of them clinked against the wall. He dodged to the side, but not fast enough. She struck the old man's kneecap, and he yelled in pain, seething. Maggie dodged to the side, reaching for the lamp on the wall, and Mowgli hissed again. Jenna reached for it, but a hand closed around her wrist. "No!" Maggie let desperation take over, and she pulled Jenna back away from the light and closer to the darkness, closer to the dwellers. Jenna struggled to keep her footing. Mr. Larconi was recovering, straightening, and reaching for the lamp. Yowling broke out, and a gray blob raised up Maggie's pant leg, sinking claws all the way up. Maggie's grip loosened as she screamed, and Jenna broke free. Mr. Larconi had the lamp, and he backed away as she lunged at him. The lamp swung in his hand, making their moving island of light tilt and sway. She glimpsed red and yellow at its edge, and cast her gaze to the wall. "There's no use in fighting. The dwellers always win." But the landlord fell and landed on his back, legs flailing as Maggie backed into him. He swung the lamp farther from Jenna. "You'll never find your way out of this world." "This world?" Jenna dodged his feet as footfalls came up behind her. Maggie had cast off Mowgli, and her foster would be ready now. Jenna grabbed a handful of gems and threw them, letting out a war cry. They flew into Maggie's scratched face, and she raised a hand to shield herself. It would buy Jenna a second or two. Where was her cat? He meowed to her left, drawing her attention, and tiny feet skittered around the flailing light as the dwellers stayed in the darkness. Mowgli ran over the landlord, drawing a grunt from him as he charged the dweller near the edge of the light. Mr. Larconi rolled over, lamp in hand. Jenna jumped over the pile, staggering, but keeping her footing. She tore the lamp from his hands just as Mowgli turned to face her. Jenna read intelligence and a warning in his big yellow eyes. Maggie wrapped her arms around her stomach from behind and squeezed, and Jenna let out her breath and tried to draw in another, but Maggie squeezed tighter and tighter. The light glared in Jenna's eyes as she fought to steady herself. She lowered the lantern, and the things drew closer. Mr. Larconi pushed himself up as if he had all the time in the world. Jenna grabbed the lamp harder as she couldn't lose it. Maggie was suffocating her, and now she'd never see daylight again. Mowgli meowed, but Mr. Larconi moved back and forth, preventing her cat from charging. The promise ring. It still sat on Jenna's middle finger with its goth spikes ready for battle. She switched the lamp to her other hand and slapped Maggie in the face with the ring over and over. At last, she gave a pained cry and let go. Jenna turned, and Maggie had one hand over her eye as she staggered into the dark to join the seething and skittering. "Mowgli!" Jenna reached for her cat, and he seemed to understand as he ran towards her, while Mr. Larconi searched the dark for Maggie. This was her only chance to run. She held the lamp in front of her, forcing the tiny monsters to part as she ran. Hints of movement seethed at the edges of the light, scattering before her. The island of light traveled with her, and she left Maggie and Mr. Larconi back in the dark. Mowgli gripped her shoulder, digging in his claws. Yellow-gray stones sped into her vision and out again. Jenna kept her gaze straight ahead. If she glimpsed those sick eyes, she'd fall over and her captors would catch up in no time. The dwellers' clicking feet kept pace behind her. It sounded like all the ants in the world were chasing her. They weren't giving up. More tiny figures dodged out of her way like rats in front of a flood, vanishing into the dark. Their enormous eyes couldn't handle the light. If she kept the lamp, she might have a chance of getting out of this massive chamber. Jenna steadied the lamp with her free hand and sucked down a lungful of damp air. She ran through a ballroom of darkness. Mr. Larconi coughed somewhere behind her. "You're never finding your way back to your world!" His voice echoed over the dwellers, coming from all directions at once. His words rang in Jenna's head. She ran, but she couldn't leave them behind. Were they really in another world? The dwellers all squeaked in unison, like it was the funniest joke they had ever heard. Jenna sucked in another breath and plowed ahead. The last of her anger melted away and terror spiked up in its place. Not on Earth. She didn't know where the exit was to this place, and now she and Mowgli would run in the darkness until her cat followed her, and maybe he knew the way out. It was possible he even explored this place before she ever came down here. She remembered what Mr. Larconi had said. Cats were a problem because they attacked the dwellers, and they were immune to their attacks. Mowgli squirmed in her grasp, begging her to let him down, and she knew she couldn't run and carry him much longer. Jenna had to trust him to get them both out of there. She did the hardest thing she'd done and set him down. He looked up at her and bounded forward as if begging her to follow. She did, nervous that sometime soon the lamp would burn out. A stone wall grew up in front of Jenna, and she skidded to a stop. The creatures did too behind her, keeping pace, not daring to come into the light. She'd reached the other side of the room. The dwellers chatted to each other like they were contemplating what move to make next. Maggie and Mr. Larconi could track her easily now that she held a light, but they deserved to get left in the dark. "Mowgli, what now?" He ran along the wall to her left with purpose. Jenna turned, running along the edge of the wall, bracing herself to crash into someone at any second. She kept her gaze forward and above the cave creatures, trying to breathe. And then something appeared, a dip in the wall that might have been a tunnel. A tunnel could mean a way out for them. More dark figures and shadows scattered before the light, and Mowgli looked at her before entering. Jenna turned, slowing just enough to stay on her feet. This must lead back up to the house's basement or something, or to some secret door Maggie used to traffic kids down here. Jenna's heart fell as she took in the details of the tunnel. Her legs kept going, but the fight melted out of her. She was running through an ancient mine. It stretched down into infinite darkness, with branches going off in all directions. The air grew thicker, dirtier, and more suffocating. The lumber supports looked ready to crash down. Some had already cracked, and others leaned towards her like wooden guards. Cobwebs pulled at her, draping her skin. The dwellers drew up closer behind, squeaking and clawing their way across the rock. This was where the dweller's slave ended up and where the gems came from. How big was this disgusting operation? Jenna tore past an intersection after Mowgli and jumped over a fallen support. She slowed as hopelessness dragged her down. Maybe she was only fit to slave away for someone else, and this was her true nature. The horror of it filled her chest, pulling her downward towards the stone. Her cat also stopped and trotted back to her, rubbing her legs and meowing. "You think we can get out?" She couldn't run much longer, and though she kept the lamp in front of her, the flame burned a little lower inside. He meowed again, gaze warm, as if to tell her she mattered. She'd rescued him, and now it was his time to save her. The tunnel grew narrower as she continued, following Mowgli. The oil sloshed around, lower, thinner. Mr. Larconi and Maggie hadn't planned on a long stay down here. This was a labyrinth, an old, abandoned part of the mine. No one was going to help. She was on her own. The dweller skittered closer, and something swiped the back of her ankle. Jenna kicked it away and staggered along. Her breathing grew heavy and ragged. She was running almost blind now, as the light had gone from yellow to a weak orange. The supports barely stood out against the stone. Something lay on the ground, complete with a wooden handle. Could it be a weapon? Could she use it to hold the dwellers back a little longer? Jenna bent over as the lamp flickered, and the dwellers behind her squealed in victory. Mowgli hissed, and that gave her the strength to seize the weapon. She had to escape. She grabbed the handle, pulling the object, a shovel, away from a tangle of white sticks. No, they were bones, the crumbling skeleton of a fallen slave. The sight made her turn with rage. Jenna clutched the weapon in one hand while keeping her eyes on the ceiling. She'd act like a cat with that same stubbornness and independence. Jenna held the lamp high with one hand, expanding the weak ring of light. Her other arm burned and quivered with the effort of holding up the shovel. She swung it down, letting it fall more than anything. The handle leaped away from her. A sick squishing sound escaped before the clang of the shovel drowned out the skittering. The light flickered and went black for a second before returning. Jenna steadied the lamp as tiny hands gripped her pants legs. The light wasn't enough to chase away the dwellers now. They were getting braver and pulling her down. Jenna! Maggie's voice echoed from somewhere back in the darkness. Get back here! Are you upset you lost your money? If Jenna would never get her freedom, at least she'd have that satisfaction. She'd smash the lamp on the ground, let the oil catch fire, and make one last run for it. But the flames would die, and the dwellers would surge forward in the dark at their full power. Even if Jenna couldn't see their eyes, they had their numbers to destroy her. More little pincers grabbed at her legs, but there was no thinking about that now. A growl sounded in the dark, and something furry brushed up against her leg. The dwellers scattered and made for the walls, pointy hats bolting back into the dark. Another growl followed, and a loud, agonized squeak came on its heels. Mowgli had chomped down on one creature like the little predator he was. The floor went still, and her cat stood there, a dead dweller hanging in his mouth like an old doll. His eyes reflected blue in the dim light, and he dropped the dweller at her feet like a gift. The others stayed away, as if fearing they were next. Genius! Jenna held back tears of relief and bent down to pick him up again, but Mowgli dodged her grasp and meowed, a short, desperate sound. Jenna knew what it meant. Follow me. If any animal could remember the way out of this place, it was him. Her cat darted ahead into the darkness, and Jenna followed. He was nothing but a gray blur ahead of her, bounding over the uneven stone. The lamp's light faded from weak orange to sick brown. If it went out, even Mowgli couldn't lead her out of here. But hope flooded into her limbs, giving her the strength to keep going. The dwellers' little feet clicked and scurried after her. They were still giving chase, and even Mowgli wouldn't hold all of them forever. And he'd be no match against Maggie and Mr. Larconi. The mine shaft sloped downward. The cobwebs thickened, and Jenna ducked under a fallen support. Slaves hadn't labored in this part of the mine for decades. The other kids, her peers, were somewhere else in this underground nightmare, toiling their lives away. Mr. Larconi and Maggie deserved to rot down here. They were the ones who didn't matter. The flame in the lamp struggling to stay lit had dulled to a nasty orange. Mowgli, hurry! Her cat broke into a full run ahead, and Jenna pumped her legs to keep up. This tunnel had no support, and chunks of broken rock lay near the walls. The cobwebs thinned and fresh air. She could somehow smell the trees, the grass, and the daylight. Here, the tunnel sloped uphill, and the stone walls changed from grayish-yellow to warmer tans, reds and browns. The air turned fresher and more alive, and Jenna ran through something electric, as if they were crossing a line and returning to their homeworld. Mowgli stopped and meowed again, and he pawed at the uneven wall as if wanting to go upward. Light poured down through a crack in the ceiling just above her head, making Jenna squint. It was just big enough for a cat to squeeze through, and a wooden step ladder led up to it. On the other side, boxes towered and a gray ceiling hung low, complete with a dingy light bulb. They had reached the basement of the house, and Jenna held back a cry of triumph. The dweller skittered up behind her. Jenna hugged the shaft of light and grabbed onto the crack above her. The board easily gave way and light spilled down. This must be the entrance Mr. Larconi and Maggie had used. The dweller squeaked in agony. Yes! Jenna pumped her fist and picked up Mowgli with her free arm. He meowed in protest at being held like that, but she didn't care. Come on, genius! She hoisted herself up the ladder, balancing the lamp and her cat. A hand seized her ankle, and someone growled. Jenna's heart leaped and Mowgli howled as the old ladder threatened to go out from under her. She dared to peek. Mr. Larconi. His face flushed with rage and deep wrinkles cut across the corners of his eyes. The dwellers were silhouettes in the darkness, toxic eyes ready to do their work. We'll teach you to disobey. Climb back down off that ladder, and you might survive. Mowgli howled again, and Jenna sucked in a breath as she grasped the floor with one hand and her cat with the other. He expected her to cry and struggle, like every other kid who thought they had no one else. Jenna would not do that anymore, because she had Mowgli and Monique. She let go of the Mowgli, and he perched on the step as if confused. Then she jumped. Mr. Larconi had no chance to react, as he still had her ankle. She crashed onto him, landing on his chest, sending him down to the dirt. Something cracked, and he screamed, let go, and fell into the darkness amidst the dwellers. Jenna didn't waste time. She pushed herself off the ground and scrambled back up the ladder to where Mowgli waited on the basement floor. Blood beaded up on her hand, but she felt no pain yet. Mr. Larconi groaned in agony, and the dwellers squeaked in defeat. Jenna turned and grabbed the loose board, sliding it back over the entrance to that world. She caught just a tiny glimpse of a sick green eye and turned away, stomach lurching. She ignored it and grabbed her cat, holding him close to her chest. He breathed against her ear, and his whiskers poked into her. He hung on tight, his back claws digging into her shirt. We're getting out of here. Jenna thundered up the stairs. Mr. Larconi shouted insults after her, his voice muffled under the boards of the tunnel. Night had fallen, and the clock above the stove read 10:55. It was the only light in the room. The dwellers wouldn't take long to catch up. It appeared they had a network running through the house so they could nab their slaves from anywhere inside. Jenna thought of all the graffiti up in her room, the scores of kids who'd gone into the dark before her. She wasn't the first, but she was going to be the last. The surrounding walls scratched and skittered as the invaders came up and flowed through the house. Mowgli meowed in warning, and Jenna knew what she had to do. She hugged him close. Hold on. The flame still burned, low and dying inside the lantern, with just enough oil to keep it lit for a few more minutes. She raised the lamp and smashed it down to the floor. Oil splattered out everywhere, and the flame caught in the middle of the kitchen floor. Fire trendles reached towards the table, towards the counter, and towards the basement stairs. The room flickered as acrid smoke made everything blur. The cupboard's door flew open, almost in panic, but Jenna didn't stay. She bolted for the front door and threw it open, breathing the best air she ever had. The stars tilted and shined overhead, and the street light cast a happy yellow glow on the pavement. Behind her, the dwellers squeaked in agony. Jenna didn't stop until she reached the street. Only when she'd made it under the circle of the streetlight did she turn and look at what she'd left. Orange and red flickered behind the kitchen window, and the old house would catch in no time. Everything, the dishes, the mess, the artwork of Mr. Larconi's past victims, would burn away. Mowgli purred and snuggled up in the crook of her neck. He was warm and cozy. She slid her arm under him, keeping him on his shoulder perch. Jenna let out a long breath, because thanks to her cat, she was free at last. And despite holding him up, a massive weight lifted off her shoulders. And yet, she felt so heavy that the weight of it all tried to pull her back down into those tunnels. So many others still labored in that dark world for those stupid gems. So many others that, unlike her, would never see the stars again. Jenna stripped off the promise ring. As far as she knew, she was the only one who knew about this horror. She threw it into the yard of the old house, and it landed on the porch and bounced into the shrubs. I'll come back for you, she said, hiking Mowgli up higher on her shoulder. I promise. Jenna turned and ran to the corner to where Monique was waiting for her.